Welcome to Black History Matters 2022, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, also known as NAHOF, located in Peterborough, New York. Black History Matters is an educational series that seeks to highlight historical events and the Black American experience. This series consists of 28 videos that NAHOF will release daily through the month of February 2022. Videos are viewable on NAHOF's website. The mission of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is to honor anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery and the legacy of that struggle, and strive to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome to today's presentation, a brief introduction to the Children's Crusade of 1963 that took place in Birmingham, Alabama. This video is an introduction to the history that will be mentioned in tomorrow's interview, where Melvin Todd, himself having marched in the Children's Crusade, will speak about his personal experiences in that tumultuous year of 1963. Birmingham, Alabama was the site of a thriving civil rights movement even before the eventful May Days that we will be speaking about today. Dr. Martin Luther King had visited Birmingham, organizing a march on the downtown area, and was arrested in April 1963. He was arrested because on April 10th of that same year, an Alabama judge granted an injunction which banned all anti-segregation protest activity in Birmingham. This meant that effectively, any kind of protest, even if nonviolent, could lead to a protester being arrested. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Reverend Ralph Abernathy were therefore arrested for their march on April 12, 1963. While in jail for 8 days before posting bail, Martin Luther King wrote his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. This letter from Birmingham Jail was responding to criticism by several clergymen who had criticized his supposedly agitating citizens on the streets rather than demanding equality through legal means in the courts. And they also characterized him as an outside agitator. This letter is actually often quoted, and I will read from a particularly well-known excerpt, which helps illustrate the valor of the children of Birmingham who would march downtown in May. The excerpt reads, "Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outsider-agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider." Dr. King's presence in Birmingham in 1963 was unsurprising, given that it was widely known that racism and racial tensions were characteristic of Birmingham. It was often called one of the South's most racist cities, with bombings consistently terrorizing the Black population of the city, particularly those who dared to speak out against segregation and inequality. This gives context to the events that would take place in May 1963 and make them all the more surprising. Though Dr. King's attempt to get the Black population of Birmingham failed to gain traction, mostly because adults knew that if they were seen protesting, they were not only risking their lives, as they could be targeted by white supremacist groups like the KKK, but they were also risking their livelihoods because, since most managerial or boss positions were reserved only for whites, any Black person that protested could be fired if they were seen or recognized. They also could not risk losing their jobs by missing workdays and going to jail, as King wanted them to. Therefore, the fear of not only physical harm, but even of facing economic hardship meant that most adults were unable or unwilling to create traction the civil rights leaders wanted to see in Birmingham. Another reason Birmingham was a pivotal place to center the push for integration was that it, like many cities across the South, had segregation embedded into its laws. For example, the Birmingham Public Accommodation Segregation Laws. Section 359, Separation of the Races, reads, It shall be unlawful for any person in charge or control of any room, hall, theater, picture house, auditorium, yard, court, ballpark, public park, or other indoor or outdoor place to which both white persons and black people are admitted, to cause, permit, or allow herein or thereon any theatrical performance, picture exhibition, speech or educational or entertainment program of any kind whatsoever, unless such room, hall, theater, picture house, auditorium, yard, court, ballpark, or other place has entrances, exits, and seating on standing sections set aside for assigned to the use of black people, unless the entrances, exits, and seating or standing sections set aside for and assigned to the use of white persons are distinctly separated from those set aside for those assigned to the use of black people, by well-defined physical barriers, and unless the members of each race are effectively restricted and confined to the sections set aside for and assigned to the use of such race. Now, this is only one example, but there are many that are very similar to it that exist within these laws. And these segregation laws would not be formally overturned until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but they go to demonstrate how it wasn't just de facto segregation that was operating in Birmingham, but it was actually ingrained into the law itself. Birmingham's political boss, Eugene Bull Connor, the Commissioner of Public Safety in charge of the police and fire departments, was an avid racist with connections to the KKK. He was so against integration that when the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights successfully sued in federal court to desegregate the city parks, this was because black people paid taxes to support the parks but were not allowed to use them. Instead of integrating the parks as he was ordered to, Bull Connor decided to close them to everyone. Now, the events of April and May of 1963 began in 1962 when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference assigned Executive Director Wyatt T. Walker to prepare a plan for Birmingham. Walker's plan, which he named Project C for confrontation, had three strategic goals. 1. To break the back of segregation in its toughest bastion, Birmingham, and by so doing, weaken segregation across everywhere in the South. 2. To generate such strong national awareness that the Kennedy administration will be forced to actively defend the civil rights of Americans, regardless of their race. And 3. To mobilize enough popular support in the North to break a Southern filibuster and pass a National Civil Rights Act to overturn all segregation laws everywhere and outlaw all forms of overt racial discrimination nationwide. As was previously mentioned, the first attempt, which was organized by adults and led by Dr. King's March, it did not succeed. The idea was to fill the jails, which in turn would put direct economic pressure on the city, which was to feed and guard the prisoners and at the same time strengthen the black boycott of the downtown businesses. Those demonstrated and being jailed were meant to be adults and college students who would commit to staying at least a week in jail before being bailed out. However, it is soon recognized that children were the only ones capable of making up the numbers to overflow the system. They were not only willing to do so, but they were excited to form a part of the freedom movement. Though the leaders did debate whether or not it was okay to allow the children to do this because they were afraid that they could be hurt, eventually adult leaders capitulated and allowed them to organize themselves. High schools across Birmingham, like Parker High, and also from nearby cities like Bessemer, organized plans to ditch class and march on the city. This arm of the movement was led by students like class presidents and prom queens, cheerleaders, and athletes. And another important role is played by black celebrities like announcers on youth black radio stations. The marches began on May 2nd, which students called D-Day, standing for Ditch Day, as they would ditch class to march. Students flooded out of schools all over Birmingham, some even traveling 18 miles from outside the city to join the demonstrations in the downtown area. Many students gathered at the 16th Baptist Church and marched out from there in waves. When one group was arrested by police waiting for them outside the church, another took its place. There were not enough cops to contain them, and police reinforcements were summoned. By the end of the day, 1,000 kids had been jailed, and police had resorted to using school buses to take children to jail because they did not have enough paddy wagons to transport all the kids. Students were arrested for parading without a permit. In jail, students were stuffed into overcrowded cells, interrogated by the police, who were trying to get them to admit who told them to march, and they were underfed, while some remained there for several days or weeks. The next day, May 3rd, to intimidate the protesters and stop what was inevitably a long-term plan by the protesters, Bull Connor ordered the firemen to meet the crowds with highly pressurized water hoses, and the police also brought the Canine Corps. Children were stripped off their feet with hoses and were bitten by police dogs. However, in the midst of this violence, the students remained calm and maintained their resolve by singing songs like Freedom, even as they were being blasted. An unintended effect of the violence was also that the entire nation and the world was now seeing the brutality that racists in the South were willing to enact upon children, with around 200 reporters covering the multi-day protests. This became a national disgrace that would no doubt play a central role in the eventual capitulation of the white leadership in Birmingham. Though the protests stopped for one day, the 5th, which was a Sunday, they continued into the next week. At that point, so many children were in jail that some schools could not continue teaching as there were no students to teach. In the meantime, President JFK sent Justice Department official Burke Marshall to calm the waters, but he was unsuccessful in convincing Dr. King or the white leadership that they should come to some accord and stop the protest. However, Bull Connor did agree to stop using violence, at least on the Monday of May 6th, to avoid images of violence dominating the media, and instead simply arrested everyone that they caught that day. By now, the boycott of stores and marches were having a significant effect. The stores were empty because white shoppers avoided the downtown area to stay out of the turmoil, and black shoppers were obviously boycotting buying from white stores. This had a tremendous effect on pressuring white business leadership in Birmingham. However, police violence resumed when jails began to overflow, and even makeshift holding areas, like the county fair where they put a lot of the kids that they arrested, were filled to the brim. At this point, the cost of holding the students had also strained the police department. However, they were unwilling to tear gas or hose the students who were protesting in the downtown area because they might injure white citizens and it might cause damage to stores. By May 7th, roughly 3,000 protesters had been arrested, and this does not include the number of students who were too young that they were simply released without really filing charges against them. On the evening of May 7th, the white leadership of Birmingham agreed to negotiate with Birmingham's black community. Dr. King declared a temporary truce on Wednesday, May 8th, which suspended the demonstrations but did not end the boycott. On May 9th, a tentative agreement is reached to end segregation. Meanwhile, a federal civil rights bill outlawing segregation is introduced by House Republicans. This law will eventually become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In Birmingham, money is raised by black leaders to post bail for all the students that were still in jail. The agreement reached by leaders of both sides is that in over 60 days, the city will desegregate public facilities in Birmingham. And this will also implement non-discriminatory hiring practices and will continue ongoing public meetings between black and white leaders. In July of 1963, the segregation ordinance are finally repealed, and white and colored signs in public facilities come down all over the city. However, the transition was not smooth and easy. The KKK organized a bombing on September 16th in the 16th Baptist Church, the same place where the students had used as a gathering point during the marches. The bombing killed 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair, and wounded more than 20 other people. Other bombings continued, and even when it was no longer legal to segregate, businesses still resisted hiring black people. However, this was a victory nonetheless, and the Children's Crusade inspired movements across other southern cities. Just within the 10 weeks after the Birmingham demonstrations, there were about 758 protests in over 186 cities across the South. This has been an introduction to the Children's Crusade of 1963. Tomorrow we will hear from Melvin Todd, who himself marched with the children as a 16-year-old in 1963. He will talk about the influences the march had on him and the general ambiance of the movement from the perspective of a kid growing up in the tumultuous 1960s. So please make sure to join us for that interview tomorrow on our YouTube channel. In the meantime, please help us by completing a brief survey available at the link on your screen and also in the video description box. Your feedback will help NAHOF receive funding and help plan future projects. Additionally, please contact NAHOF with any questions and if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. Thank you for joining me today in this presentation, and we hope to see you tomorrow for Melvin's interview.